There are mornings that arrive with quiet mercy, easing you into consciousness with birdsong or golden light. And then there are mornings like the one that greeted Maya Chen on November 3rd, when she woke to her 7-year-old daughter shaking her shoulder in the pre-dawn darkness of their 2006 Honda Civic, parked behind a 24-hour Walmart in Newport, Rhode Island. Mom, I need the bathroom." Lily's voice came urgent, apologetic, already holding back tears because she knew, she already knew at 7 years old, that asking for basic human necessities had become a complicated negotiation with reality. Maya's eyes opened to the familiar view, condensation coating the inside of the windows, creating a privacy curtain that also trapped the smell of 3 people and a dog living in 140 square feet of mobile desperation. Her mother, June, was already awake in the passenger seat, arthritic hands wrapped around a thermos of yesterday's gas station coffee, reheated on their camping stove the night before. "Come on, baby." Maya's voice came out scratchy, exhausted from another night of sleeping at angles the human spine had spent millennia learning to hate. She checked her phone. 5:47 a.m. The Walmart bathrooms would be open, and if they were lucky, the early morning security guard would be the one who pretended not to notice that the same car had been in his parking lot for 6 nights running. They made the walk across the lot in the November cold that came off the Atlantic like a living thing with teeth. Lily clutched her stuffed elephant, Peanut, against her chest. Maya's mother moved slowly, each step in negotiation with joints that had worked 40 years in a Providence garment factory and now sent sharp reminders that rest was a luxury the body no longer tolerated well. Inside, the fluorescent lights felt aggressive after the darkness. Maya caught their reflection in the bathroom mirror. 3 generations of Chun women, all wearing the particular exhaustion that came from having nowhere to go and all day to get there. Lily, small for 7, with her father's eyes and Maya's stubborn chin. June, 68, gray hair pulled back in a bun that hadn't changed style since 1982, face carved with wrinkles that told stories of immigration, hard work, and losses that compounded like interest on unpayable debt. And Maya herself, 32 years old, mechanical engineering degree from URI that apparently meant nothing when the shipyard laid off 200 workers and the job market decided that overqualified single mother was code for absolutely not. Her dark hair needed washing. Her clothes, jeans, and a URI sweatshirt that had seen better semesters, needed the laundromat they couldn't afford. They had been living in the car for 73 days. Maya knew the exact count because insomnia had a way of turning every night into an involuntary math exercise. 73 days since the eviction notice became final. 73 days since Marcus, Lily's father, had made his last child support payment before disappearing to Florida with his new girlfriend and a selective memory about having a daughter who needed things like food and shelter. The morning routine had become practiced. Bathroom, then to the McDonald's 3 blocks away, where Maya would buy 1 coffee and Lily would get a hash brown, and they'd stretch the meal across an hour while June saved money by claiming she'd already eaten. Then to the library when it opened at 9, where Lily could do homework and Maya could apply for jobs on the public computers, manufacturing optimism in cover letters that went nowhere. But this morning, something was different. As they walked back toward the car, Maya noticed people gathering near the marina. Even at 6:15 a.m., a small crowd had formed near the harbor master's office, bundled against the cold, pointing toward the water where dawn was just starting to paint the sky in shades of pewter and rose. What's happening? Lily's curiosity, at least, hadn't been beaten down by circumstance yet. They walked closer. The crowd, maybe 20 people, mostly fishermen and early morning boat owners, were focused on something in harbor. Maya followed their gaze and saw it. A ship, listing badly to starboard, sitting in the shallow water near the far pier like a drunk, trying to remember how it got there. Not a ship, a wreck. Even from this distance, Maya's engineering eye cataloged the damage. Wooden hull weathered to gray, masts long gone or broken off at the deck line, barnacles and marine growth covering every visible surface. The thing sat in maybe 12 feet of water, its deck partially submerged, only about 30 feet of hull visible above the waterline. Storm last night pushed it up from the deep channel. A grizzled fisherman was explaining to anyone who'd listen. Been down there for decades, probably. Tide and current finally shifted it into the shallows. Harbor master's gonna have a fit, trying to figure out what to do with it. Maya moved closer, drawn by something she couldn't name. The wreck was old, really old. The design wasn't modern fishing vessel or pleasure craft. The hull shape, what she could see of it, suggested late 19th century construction, maybe earlier. The wood was dark with age and marine growth, but the structure looked surprisingly intact for something that had been underwater for what? A century? More? Her mother appeared beside her, squinting at the wreck with the same analytical intensity Maya recognized from her own engineering work. June had spent 4 decades working with textiles and patterns, developing an eye for detail that age hadn't dimmed. Old ship. Very old. June's English carried the accent of someone who'd learned the language at 40 and never quite lost the Cantonese musicality underneath. In the water long time. A man in a harbor patrol jacket was taking photographs. Radio, crackling with conversation Maya couldn't quite make out. Another man, wearing a suit that seemed absurdly formal for 6:30 a.m. at a marina, stood with a clipboard, making notes with the air of someone who was already calculating costs and complications. The harbor master, presumably, looked like he'd aged 10 years since discovering this problem. He was fielding questions from boat owners worried about navigation hazards, from insurance people worried about liability, and from what appeared to be a local news crew that had materialized with the inevitability of vultures at carrion. Maya listened to the conversations swirling around her, piecing together the situation. The wreck was a hazard. It needed to be removed, but removal cost money the city didn't want to spend. The harbor master was talking about maritime salvage law, about the possibility of auctioning the wreck to the highest bidder just to get it gone, about environmental regulations and historical preservation committees that would need to be consulted. Lily tugged Maya's hand. "Mom, can we go? I'm cold." But Maya couldn't move. Something about the wreck held her attention with almost gravitational force. Her engineering background made her see what others might miss. Despite the obvious age and deterioration, the whole structure looked sound. The way it sat in the water, the angle of the list, suggested the internal compartments might still be intact. This wasn't just a pile of rotten timber. This was a vessel that had been built well enough to survive a century underwater and still maintain structural integrity. That meant cargo holds that might still be sealed, compartments that might still be dry, or at least protected from the worst of the ocean, contents that could have been preserved. The thought was ridiculous. This was somebody's long-lost fishing boat, or a merchant vessel that had gone down in a storm and been forgotten. The chances of finding anything of value were approximately zero. Maritime salvage was complicated, expensive, and usually resulted in nothing but debt and disappointment. But there was something else. Something in Maya's chest that felt like the ghost of her engineering professor's voice from senior year. Sometimes the best opportunities look like disasters to everyone else. The trick is knowing when to see past the obvious. The crowd was starting to disperse as the cold drove them back toward coffee and warm cars. Maya heard the harbor master on his radio, discussing timelines and removal procedures, mentioning something about an emergency auction if no one claimed salvage rights. June touched Maya's arm. "We should go. Library opens soon. Lily needs breakfast." The practical concerns of survival demanding attention. But Maya stood there another moment, looking at the wreck, at this impossible thing that had surfaced from the deep like an answer to a question she hadn't known she was asking. They walked back to the car, stopping at McDonald's for the usual breakfast negotiation. Lily got her hash brown and milk. Maya got coffee. June insisted she'd already eaten, which was a lie they'd all agreed to pretend was true. The library opened at 9. They claimed their usual table near the back, away from foot traffic, where Lily could spread out her homework and June could read Chinese newspapers on the computer terminals reserved for seniors. Maya logged into the job search portal, the same one she'd been using for 2 months, and saw the same postings that had been there yesterday. Engineering positions requiring 5 years' experience she didn't have, or willing to hire someone with her qualifications, but located in Texas or California, or other places that might as well be the moon for someone with $127 in checking and no way to relocate. But her mind kept drifting back to the wreck. Between applications, she found herself searching maritime salvage law in Rhode Island, auction procedures, historical ship registries. The research spiraled, one link leading to another, the way engineering problems always expanded when you started examining them seriously. She learned that unclaimed wrecks could be auctioned for removal costs, that salvage rights granted ownership of vessel and contents, that the process was deliberately designed to be cheap and fast because harbor authorities wanted problems solved, not preserved. She learned that Rhode Island had been a major shipping port in the 18th and 19th centuries, that hundreds of vessels had gone down in local waters, and that most were never recovered because the cost exceeded the value. She learned about the opium trade, about merchant vessels that had carried cargo from Asia to American ports, about the wealth that had flowed through Newport before the modern era. The pieces assembled in her mind like parts of an engine, connecting in ways that created something larger than the sum of their individual components. The wreck was old, possibly very old. The whole design suggested cargo capacity, merchant vessel rather than fishing boat. The location, Newport Harbor, had historical significance as a trading port, and the structural integrity suggested sealed compartments that might have protected contents for decades or longer. It was a fantasy, a desperate woman's fever dream, trying to find hope in random coincidence and underwater garbage. But Maya had spent 4 years studying engineering precisely because she loved solving puzzles that everyone else had given up on. She loved taking apart machines and understanding how they worked, finding the elegant solutions hidden in apparent chaos. What if, and it was a huge if, what if the wreck wasn't garbage? What if it was actually something worth investigating? Mom? Lily's voice brought her back to reality. Can we go to the playground after the library? Please? Maya checked her phone. 2:47 p.m. Lily had been doing homework and reading for 5 hours, trapped in a library because they had nowhere else to be. Her daughter deserved a childhood, deserved playgrounds and friends, and the illusion of normalcy that Maya couldn't provide. Yeah, baby, we can go to the playground. But that evening, after Lily fell asleep in the back seat and June dozed in the passenger seat, Maya lay awake in the half-reclined driver's seat, looking at the Walmart parking lot lights creating sodium vapor constellations against the November sky. Her phone showed $127.43 in checking, $0 in savings, and approximately $11 in the center console coin collection that was supposed to be emergency money for emergencies too small for the actual emergency fund. She thought about the wreck sitting in Newport Harbor, about how the harbor master had mentioned an auction, about how sometimes opportunity disguised itself as disaster to filter out everyone except the desperate or the brave or the stupid enough to look closer. Sleep didn't come. At 2 a.m., she gave up and opened her laptop, connected to the Walmart Wi-Fi, and started researching maritime salvage auctions with the focus of someone who had nothing to lose except everything. The notice appeared the next morning on the Newport Harbor Authority website, buried in the administrative announcements section where most people would never think to look. Emergency salvage auction. Unidentified vessel, Newport Harbor. Scheduled for November 8th, 10 a.m. Minimum bid, $1. Buyer responsible for removal within 30 days or face penalties. Vessel sold as is, no warranties, no inspections permitted prior to sale. Maya read it 3 times, her heart doing something complicated in her chest. Minimum bid, $1. She had $127. Technically, she could afford this. The rational part of her brain, the part that had graduated summa cum laude and understood risk assessment, started listing objections immediately. She had no way to move a waterlogged wreck, no equipment for salvage operations, no money for removal costs or environmental cleanup if the thing contained fuel or chemicals. This was insane. This was how broke people became broker, chasing fantasies instead of focusing on survival. But another part of her brain, the part that had chosen engineering because she believed problems had solutions if you were smart enough to find them, whispered that sometimes the bravest thing you could do was bet everything on yourself. She had $127 and change. She had nowhere to live. She had a daughter who deserved better and a mother who had given up everything to help care for Lily, while Maya worked jobs that no longer existed. She had nothing left to lose except the car and the clothes and garbage bags that constituted their entire worldly possessions. And she had a degree in mechanical engineering, which meant she knew how to take apart complex machines and understand how they worked. A ship was just a very large, very wet machine. If the hull was intact, if the compartments were sealed, if there was anything inside worth recovering, she might be the only person in Newport with the training to figure it out. The thought was absurd. It was desperate. It was the kind of decision made by someone who'd been pushed so far past reasonable that the only direction left was forward into unknown territory. That evening at the library, while Lily colored and June read, Maya researched everything she could find about salvage operations, removal costs, and marine restoration. She learned that many salvage companies would work on commission if they believed a wreck held value, that structural assessments could be done relatively cheaply, that if the vessel turned out to be historically significant, grants and museum funding might cover costs. She also learned that 99% of salvage operations recovered nothing of value, and that most people who bought wrecks at auction ended up owing more in removal fees than the vessel was worth. But that 1%, that found something, that 1% that turned disaster into opportunity because they'd been willing to look when everyone else walked away. Lily appeared beside her chair. Peanut the elephant clutched tight. "Mom, are you okay? You look worried." Maya closed her laptop and pulled her daughter into her lap, feeling the small, solid weight of her, the trust that radiated from a 7-year-old who still believed her mother could fix anything. "I'm trying to figure something out, baby. Something that might be really good or might be really stupid." "What is it?" How to explain complicated hope to a child living in a car. How to describe the feeling that sometimes the universe left clues, and you either followed them or spent the rest of your life wondering what if. There's an old ship in the harbor. It's broken and nobody wants it. There's an auction where someone can buy it for almost no money. And I'm thinking about buying it. Lily's eyes went wide. Like a pirate ship? Sort of. It's really old, and it's been underwater for a long time. Most people think it's just junk that needs to be thrown away. But I think maybe there's something important about it. Maybe something valuable inside that everyone else is missing. Are you going to buy it? The question hung in the air of the quiet library. Outside the window, November darkness was falling early, the way it did in New England when winter started asserting itself. Soon they'd have to return to the car, to another night of cramped sleep and morning cold. "I don't know yet," Maya answered honestly. "It would cost almost all the money we have, and it might be a terrible mistake. But sometimes you have to take chances when safe choices have stopped working." June appeared, moving slowly toward their table, face showing the lines that pain carved when arthritis flared. She'd been listening, Maya realized. Had probably been listening since the conversation started. "Old ship," June said, settling into a chair with careful precision. "You know about ships?" "I know about engineering," Maya replied. "About structures and materials and how things hold together or fall apart. A ship is just a floating building, and that one's been underwater for maybe 100 years, but its hull still looks solid. That means it was built well. That means maybe the inside is protected." June studied her daughter with eyes that had seen Maya through childhood fevers and teenage mistakes and marriage to a man who'd proven himself unworthy of the word father. Or maybe means it's just rotten boat that costs more money to remove than we have to spend. The practical truth, delivered with immigrant pragmatism that had kept June alive through revolution, immigration, widowhood, and exile. Maya felt the weight of it, the responsibility of having to be responsible for 3 people in a car with nowhere to go. "Yeah," she admitted. "Probably it's just a rotten boat. Probably I'm seeing patterns that aren't there because I'm desperate." "But," June prompted, "but sometimes desperate is what it takes to do something brave. And I'd rather fail trying than spend the rest of my life wondering what I was too scared to attempt." Silence stretched between them while Lily colored, oblivious to the magnitude of what was being discussed. Then June reached across the table and took Maya's hand, her grip surprisingly strong despite the arthritis. Your grandfather, my husband, he came to America with $80 an idea for business everyone said would fail. Spent everything on used sewing machines and space in bad building. Everyone told him he was stupid, throwing away money on impossible dream. She paused, memory clearly sharp despite the decades. He worked 16-hour days for 3 years. Almost lost everything twice. But that impossible business paid for house, paid for your mother's education, paid for life in America. Maya felt her throat tighten. Grandpa died when I was 8. I barely remember him. He would say same thing I say now. Safe choices feel safe until you realize they're leading nowhere. Dangerous choices feel dangerous until they succeed. She squeezed Maya's hand harder. You have engineering degree. You have smart brain. You have nothing to lose except nothing, which is what we already have. Buy the ship. See what inside. If it's nothing, we know worse than before. If it's something, her voice trailed off into possibilities neither wanted to speak aloud and risk jinxing. That night, Maya lay awake until dawn, running calculations in her head. The auction was in 3 days. Minimum bid, $1. If she won, she'd have maybe $126 left for removal costs, assessment fees, whatever charges accumulated from owning a wreck in a public harbor. It was insane. It violated every principle of financial responsibility she'd ever learned. But those principles had gotten her evicted and living in a car, so perhaps they weren't as reliable as advertised. At 5 a.m., she opened her banking app and looked at the balance, $127.43. Then she opened her email and drafted a message to the Harbor Authority, requesting to register for the salvage auction on November 8th. Her finger hovered over the send button for 30 seconds that felt like hours. Behind her, Lily stirred in sleep, making the small sounds children make when dreaming of better mornings. June's breathing came steady from the passenger seat, each breath a reminder of responsibilities Maya carried. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is bet everything on yourself when everyone else has already counted you out. Maya hit send. The morning of November 8th arrived with the kind of cold that made breathing feel like inhaling knives. Maya woke at 4:30 a.m. in the Walmart parking lot, her body stiff from another night folded into the driver's seat at angles that would require a chiropractor she couldn't afford to undo. Lily was still sleeping in the back, wrapped in every blanket they owned. Peanut the elephant clucked under her chin. June sat awake in the passenger seat, hands wrapped around a thermos of gas station coffee, watching dawn try to happen through a sky the color of old pewter. The auction started at 10 a.m. Maya had 4.5 hours to get herself, her daughter, and her mother through morning routines and to the Harbor Authority office looking like people whose opinions should be taken seriously, rather than 3 homeless women living in a car who were about to do something monumentally stupid. They used the McDonald's bathroom for the morning cleanup. Maya did her best with wet paper towels and the travel-sized toiletries from the dollar store, trying to transform car sleeping exhaustion into something approximating professional competence. She changed into her one good shirt, a button-down that had survived 2 months in garbage bags relatively unwrinkled, and jeans that were clean if not exactly interview-appropriate. Lily got dressed in her school clothes, the outfit they saved for when appearance mattered. June wore the same thing she always wore, practical slacks and a cardigan that had been mended so many times it was more repair than original garment, but was clean and dignified in the way June approached everything. They ate breakfast at McDonald's, 1 Egg McMuffin split 3 ways, coffee for Maya, milk for Lily, hot water for June, who'd brought her own tea bag from a stash she maintained with the fierce economy of someone who'd survived actual poverty, not just American broke. At 9:30, they drove to the Newport Harbor Authority building, a utilitarian structure near the marina that smelled like salt water, diesel fuel, and bureaucratic indifference. The parking lot held maybe 8 vehicles, most of them trucks belonging to marine services companies or fishermen who'd been summoned for various harbor business. Maya pulled into a spot, killed the engine, and sat for a moment listening to metal tick as it cooled. This was it. In 30 minutes, she'd either walk away having preserved her $127 for gas and food, or she'd own a waterlogged wreck and have approximately $126 left between her family and absolute destitution. You sure about this? June's question came gentle, without judgment. Maya looked at her reflection in the rearview mirror. 32 years old, mechanical engineering degree, 0 job prospects, living in a car with her daughter and mother. The rational choice was obvious. Walk away, preserve capital, focus on survival. No, she answered honestly. I'm not sure, but I don't think sure is something we can afford right now. They climbed out into cold that bit through inadequate jackets. Lily held Maya's hand tightly, sensing without being told that this was important, that the adults were scared even if they were hiding it. They walked across the parking lot toward the building. 3 generations of Chun women who'd run out of safe choices and were now improvising in territory marked "Here Be Dragons" on all reasonable maps. The auction room was a conference space that had seen better decades, with fluorescent lights that hummed like mechanical bees and linoleum floors that had given up pretending to be anything but institutional. About 15 people sat in folding chairs facing a podium where a man in his 50s wearing a Harbor Patrol jacket was reviewing paperwork with the enthusiasm of someone fulfilling obligations rather than pursuing passions. Maya, June, and Lily found seats in the back row. The other attendees looked exactly like people who'd come to bid on salvage. Commercial fishermen in work clothes, a couple of marine salvage company representatives in company polo shirts, and 3 men who had the particular swagger of people who bought distressed assets for profit. One of those men, late 40s, expensive sailing jacket, the kind of tan that came from yacht clubs rather than working boats, noticed Maya and her family with visible surprise. He leaned toward his companion, a younger man who might have been a son or business partner, and said something that made them both smirk. Maya felt the familiar heat of being noticed for wrong reasons, being assessed and found wanting by people who'd never had to choose between gas money and groceries. She kept her expression neutral, focused forward, refusing to acknowledge that she'd registered their attention. The harbor master, badge identified him as Robert Morrison, called the room to order at 10:03. His voice carried the particular exhaustion of civil servants dealing with problems they hadn't created and couldn't solve. Thank you all for coming. As stated in the public notice, we're here to auction salvage rights for one unidentified vessel currently positioned in Newport Harbor, Pier 7, approximate coordinates 41.49 north, 71.33 west. He clicked a remote, and a projector illuminated the screen behind him with photographs of the wreck Maya had been obsessing over for 3 days. The images showed the vessel from multiple angles, listing to starboard, hull weathered dark gray, barnacles and marine growth covering every visible surface. The masts were gone or broken off at deck level. What remained sat in maybe 12 feet of water, about 30 feet of hull visible above the waterline. Vessel is sold as is, Morrison continued. No warranties, no inspections permitted prior to sale. Buyer assumes all responsibility for removal within 30 days of purchase, all environmental cleanup costs, and all liability associated with ownership. Minimum bid is $1. Do I have any questions before we proceed? A fisherman in the 3rd row raised his hand. Any idea what it is? How old? Morrison shrugged. Unknown. Best estimate from our consultant is late 19th century, possibly earlier. Could be merchant vessel, fishing boat, or private craft. It's been submerged for decades at minimum. Storm surge 2 weeks ago shifted it from the deep channel into shallow water, where it became a navigation hazard. Hence this auction. The man in the expensive sailing jacket, Maya heard someone call him Brent Caldwell, raised his hand with the casual confidence of someone accustomed to being heard. What's the removal cost estimate? Morrison consulted his paperwork. Commercial salvage companies have quoted between $15,000 and $30,000 depending on approach. Vessel would need to be lifted, transported, and either restored or scrapped according to environmental regulations. A murmur went through the room. $30,000 for removal meant this wasn't a bargain for anyone except salvage companies who could do the work themselves or people with deep enough pockets to treat it as a gamble on potential contents. Maya felt her stomach drop. 30,000. She had $127. Even if she bought the wreck for a single dollar, she had no way to afford removal. This was insane. This was desperation masquerading as strategy. June's hand found hers, squeezed once. The gesture carried weight. We came this far. See it through. Morrison raised his gavel, an actual wooden gavel that looked like it had been salvaged from somewhere more important. We'll proceed with open bidding. Minimum increment is $1. Do I hear an opening bid? Silence stretched for 5 long seconds. The salvage company representatives were studying phones, calculating costs against potential return. The fisherman looked skeptical, probably running mental math about working hours versus gambling on underwater treasure that almost certainly didn't exist. Then Brent Caldwell raised his paddle with theatrical flourish. $1. Scattered laughter rippled through the room. Morrison nodded without smiling. I have $1. Do I hear $2? One of the salvage company men raised his paddle. $2. $3. Called a fisherman who might have been bidding as joke or serious speculation. The bidding progressed in single-dollar increments, more entertainment than auction, the price crawling upward as people decided whether they were serious or just preventing anyone else from winning too cheaply. $5. $7. $10. Maya sat frozen, paddle in hand, watching the prize climb past what she'd expected. She'd thought, stupidly, desperately, that no one would want a waterlogged wreck requiring $30,000 in removal costs. But apparently the novelty of owning a 19th century shipwreck was worth more than pocket change to several people in this room. $15, Brent Caldwell announced with smug satisfaction, looking around the room as if daring anyone to challenge him. Morrison raised his gavel. I have $15. Do I hear 16? Maya's hand moved before conscious thought approved the motion, raising her paddle with fingers that trembled slightly. $16, Morrison acknowledged, looking at her directly for the first time. The room shifted attention toward the back row where Maya sat with her daughter and elderly mother, 3 obviously broke women who had no business bidding on salvage operations. Brent Caldwell turned in his seat, located Maya, and his expression cycled through surprise to amusement to something that looked like pity wrapped in condescension. He raised his paddle again. $20. The number hung in the air. Maya had $127 total. 20 was affordable, but every dollar she spent here was a dollar she couldn't spend on gas or food or the 1,000 small emergencies that constant poverty demanded. 25, she heard herself say, voice steadier than her hands. Morrison nodded. I have 25. Do I hear 30? The salvage company representative shook his head and lowered his paddle, apparently having reached his limit of participating in what he decided was a joke. The fishermen were all out. It was down to Maya and Brent Caldwell and maybe one other man in the front row who looked interested but uncommitted. Caldwell stood, turning to address Maya directly, his voice carrying across the small room with the projection of someone accustomed to being heard. Miss, I don't think you understand what you're bidding on. That wreck will cost $30,000 minimum to remove. It's probably full of mud and rotted wood. You'll end up owing the city more than it's worth. He smiled with the practiced kindness of someone delivering hard truths to naive children. I'm trying to do you a favor by warning you off. Maya felt every eye in the room on her, felt the weight of judgment from people who'd assessed her car-sleeping clothes and visible poverty and decided she didn't belong here. Felt Lily's small hand grip her arm. Felt June's presence beside her radiating the quiet strength of someone who'd survived worse humiliations than casual condescension. I have a degree in mechanical engineering, Maya said, keeping her voice level professional. I understand structural mechanics, material stress analysis, and how to assess whether something is worth investigating. What I see is a hull that's maintained integrity after decades underwater, which suggests quality construction and possibly protected internal compartments. What you see is an expensive inconvenience you want to flip for profit. We're looking at the same thing with different expertise. The room went quiet. Caldwell's smile froze, became something sharper. His voice lost its false kindness. $50. Morrison looked at Maya. I have 50. Do I hear 60? This was it. The moment where prudence demanded walking away, preserving capital, accepting defeat gracefully. $50 was already insane for what was probably rotted timber and disappointment. Maya thought about her grandfather, arriving in America with $80 and a dream everyone called impossible. Thought about Thomas Brennan in the second inspiration story, spending a decade documenting evidence when everyone told him to quit. Thought about Claire Donovan buying a dead bakery truck for her last $300. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is bet everything when safe choices have already failed. $100, Maya said clearly. The room reacted with audible surprise. Morrison's eyebrows rose. $100. Do I hear 110? Caldwell was no longer smiling. He studied Maya with reassessment, tried to determine if she was serious or delusional or possessed of information he lacked. His paddle stayed down. The room waited. Going once, Morrison intoned. Going twice. He raised his gavel, and Maya's heart hammered against her ribs with enough force to be visible through her shirt. The gavel fell. Sold to bidder 14 for $100. The sound of wood striking wood echoed in the conference room like a gunshot or a starting pistol, or the noise the universe makes when someone commits to being brave or stupid and won't know which until much later. Maya sat frozen, processing what she'd just done. She'd spent $100, 77% of her total assets. On a waterlogged wreck, she had no way to move and no idea how to investigate. She had $27.43 left between her family and absolute destitution. Lily leaned close, voice small and excited. Mom, did we just buy a pirate ship? Sort of, baby. Maya's voice came out shaky. We just bought something that's either really valuable or really stupid. We're going to find out which. The paperwork took 20 minutes. Morrison processed the transfer with bureaucratic efficiency, generating documents that made Maya Chen the legal owner of Lot 47, one unidentified vessel currently moored at Pier 7, with all attendant responsibilities and liabilities. She paid with 5 $20 bills from her emergency cash, watching her financial security evaporate into government receipts and ownership certificates. Other auction attendees filed out, most ignoring Maya entirely, a few glancing back with expressions ranging from pity to amusement. Brent Caldwell stopped at the door, turned back, addressed her with the particular cruelty that comes wrapped in helpful concern. You just bought yourself a very expensive mistake, sweetheart. That $30,000 in removal costs? The clock starts now. You've got 30 days before the penalties start accumulating at $500 per day. Hope your engineering degree covers financial mathematics, because you're going to need it when the bills come due. He left. Maya stood in the empty conference room holding documents that proved she now owned something everyone agreed was worthless, that would cost money she didn't have to remove, and that represented either the worst decision of her life or the beginning of something she couldn't yet name. June appeared beside her, took one of the documents, studied it with the careful attention she'd given fabric patterns for 40 years. Legal owner now. Cannot turn back. No, Maya agreed. Can't turn back. Can only move forward and see what we've actually got. They walked out into November cold that felt sharper than before, as if the weather was offering commentary on financial decisions. The harbor was visible from the parking lot, and Maya could see her ship, God help her, listing in the shallow water about 300 yards away. We should go look at it, Lily announced with 7-year-old logic that cut through Maya's spiral of doubt. If we own it, we should see it. She was right. Maya had just bet everything on a wreck she'd only seen from a distance. Time to actually inspect what she'd bought. They drove to Pier 7, parked in a public lot that charged $5 she couldn't afford but paid anyway. The pier extended maybe 200 feet into the harbor. Commercial fishing boats moored along its length, the smell of diesel and fish and salt water creating an atmosphere that was both industrial and organic. At the pier's end, Maya could see her wreck clearly for the first time. Up close, it looked simultaneously worse and better than the auction photo suggested. Worse because the marine growth was even more extensive than pictures revealed, the hull covered in barnacles and seaweed that made assessing actual condition difficult. Better because the structure itself, beneath the biological decoration, looked solid. The whole planking was intact, no obvious holes or collapse. The list to starboard was pronounced but stable, suggesting whatever flooding had occurred had reached equilibrium rather than active sinking. Maya stood at the pier's edge, studying the wreck with her engineering eye, cataloging details. The vessel was maybe 60 feet long, which suggested merchant capacity rather than personal craft. The hull shape indicated cargo space, a wide beam relative to length, designed for carrying weight rather than speed. The construction technique looked like traditional planking over frames, pre-steel age shipbuilding. But it was the stern that caught her attention and held it with growing excitement. There, barely visible above the waterline and marine growth, she could make out carved letters that time and ocean hadn't quite erased. Gress, Port R.I. Part of a name. Part of a home port registration. Evidence that this vessel had been real, registered, documented in historical records that might still exist. Mom, look. Lily pointed toward the deck, visible just above the waterline. Is it a door? Maya followed her daughter's gesture and saw it. A hatch cover, still secured, barnacles covering the hinges but the structure intact. A sealed compartment. A cargo hold that might have remained dry or at least protected from the worst of the ocean. The impossible possibility crashed over her with enough force to make breathing difficult. If the hatches were sealed, if the cargo holds were intact, if whatever the ship had been carrying when it went down was still inside, she needed equipment, needed diving gear, or at least a way to access the deck without climbing over barnacle-covered surfaces that would slice skin to ribbons. Needed tools for opening hatches that had been underwater for decades. Needed approximately 1,000 things she couldn't afford and had no way to obtain. A voice called from behind them. That your wreck? Maya turned to find a man approaching, maybe 60, weathered face suggesting decades of outdoor work, wearing coveralls that advertised Santos Marine Salvage and Repair. He walked with the rolling gait of someone whose body had spent more time on boats than land. Just bought it at auction, Maya confirmed, uncertain whether this was opportunity or complication. The man stopped beside her, studied the wreck with professional assessment. Name's Carlos Santos. I run the salvage yard 2 piers down. Heard about the auction, figured someone would buy it for scrap value, if nothing else. He glanced at Maya. You planning to flip it to a salvage company, or you actually going to investigate what's inside? I want to investigate it, Maya answered honestly. But I don't have equipment or funds for diving operations. I have. She paused, calculating what truth was safe to share. I have engineering knowledge and the belief that there might be something worth finding. What I lack is capital and resources. Carlos nodded slowly, still studying the wreck. That design, that construction technique, I've been working these waters for 40 years. That's not local fishing vessel. Hull shape suggests cargo capacity. The stern carving, what's left of it, looks like merchant registration from the 1800s, maybe earlier. He pointed toward the sealed hatches. Those compartments might still be intact. If there's cargo inside that survived, could be valuable. Could also be nothing but mud and rotten wood. He turned to look at Maya directly. I'll make you an offer. I provide equipment, diving expertise, access to my facilities for cleaning and assessment. In exchange, I get 20% of whatever value we recover. If we find nothing, you owe me nothing. If we find something valuable, we split it 70-30, you favor. He extended his hand. I gamble my time and equipment against your wreck. Fair? Maya's mind raced through implications. This was either legitimate opportunity or a con artist recognizing desperation. But she had no other options. No way to investigate the wreck alone. No resources to hire professional salvage operations. This was accept help with strings attached or watch 30 days pass, while penalties accumulated and her $100 investment became a debt she could never repay. She shook his hand. Deal. But I want documentation. Contracts specifying terms. Carlos smiled with what looked like genuine respect. Smart. I'll have my lawyer draw something up. We can start assessment tomorrow if weather holds. He looked at the wreck again, expression thoughtful. You know, most people who buy wrecks at auction are looking for scrap metal or an easy flip. You're looking at that thing like you actually believe it's hiding something worth finding. That's either really brave or really stupid? My mother says it's both, Maya replied. He laughed. Your mother's probably right. Meet me here at 8 a.m. tomorrow. Bring work clothes you don't mind destroying. We're going diving. That evening, parked in their usual Walmart lot, Maya spread the ownership documents across the dashboard and used her laptop to research historical ship registries, Newport maritime records, anything that might identify her wreck. The partial name, Gress Port RI, was enough to narrow possibilities significantly. After 2 hours of searching through digitized historical databases, cross-referencing shipping records from the 1800s, she found it. The Lady's Progress, registered Newport, Rhode Island, 1847. Merchant vessel, 63 feet, documented as trading route between Newport and Hong Kong via San Francisco during the California Gold Rush era. The historical record included cargo manifests, customs declarations, and insurance documents. The Lady's Progress had made 4 successful voyages between 1847 and 1851, carrying manufactured goods west and bringing back silk, porcelain, and other Asian imports. The ship's final voyage departed Hong Kong in August 1851, bound for San Francisco and then Newport, cargo declared as textiles, porcelain, medicinal supplies. And then nothing. No arrival record in San Francisco. No insurance claim filed in Newport. The Lady's Progress simply vanished from the historical record, one of hundreds of vessels lost to storms or pirates or navigation errors in an era when crossing oceans meant accepting mortality as a business expense. But here was the thing that made Maya's engineering brain start connecting patterns. The ship's final cargo manifest, filed with Hong Kong Customs in August 1851, listed medicinal supplies as a significant portion of the cargo value. In 1851, that term had specific meaning. It meant opium. Legal at the time, hugely profitable, transported in sealed tins or containers designed to survive ocean voyages. If the Lady's Progress had gone down off Newport after making it back from Asia, if the cargo holds were sealed, if the opium containers had survived. But Maya pushed that thought away before it could take root. Calculating value based on century-old cargo manifests was fantasy economics. The ship might not even be the Lady's Progress. The cargo might have been offloaded elsewhere. The holds might be flooded and empty. Building hope on historical records and educated guesses was how desperate people convinced themselves that poverty was temporary and luck was pending. Still, she saved the research, documented her findings, created a folder of historical references that might prove useful. Whether the wreck held treasure or trash, she'd approach it with the same systematic methodology she'd learned in engineering school. Gather data, test hypotheses, draw conclusions based on evidence rather than wishful thinking. Lily appeared from the back seat, wrapped in blankets, peanut clutched tight. Mom, are we going to be okay? The question cut through Maya's research fog and landed in her chest with weight that made breathing difficult. Lily was 7. She shouldn't have to worry about whether her family would be okay. She should be worried about homework and playground politics, not financial survival and whether tomorrow's meals were guaranteed. Maya pulled her daughter into her lap, held her close, breathed in the scent of her hair, strawberry shampoo from the McDonald's bathroom, already fading but still there. Yeah, baby, we're going to be okay. Tomorrow we start investigating the ship. We'll find out what's inside, and whatever happens, we'll handle it together. What if there's nothing valuable? The question deserved honesty. Then we'll have an adventure, and we'll figure out something else. But we'll still have each other. And that's worth more than anything we might find in an old ship. Lily nodded against Maya's shoulder, trusting with the absolute faith children have before the world teaches them otherwise. June watched from the passenger seat, face unreadable in the dashboard light, but her expression carried approval or at least acceptance that they'd committed to this path and would see it through. That night Maya lay awake until 3 a.m., laptop glowing, researching opium trade routes and cargo preservation and maritime salvage law. She built spreadsheets estimating potential values if they found anything worth recovering, calculated break-even points against removal costs, created scenario models ranging from complete loss to unlikely windfall. The numbers were brutal. Even if they found valuable cargo, selling it would be complicated by historical preservation laws, questions of legal ownership, and the possibility that cultural heritage regulations might claim anything significantly old or historically important. She might discover treasure and still end up broke because bureaucracy moved slower than penalty accumulation. But there was something else in the research, something that emerged from cross-referencing manifests and customs records and insurance documents. The Lady's Progress had been heavily insured for its final voyage, unusual for merchant vessels of that era, unless the cargo value justified the premium. The insurance company, Merchants Maritime of Providence, had never paid the claim because the ship's disappearance was never conclusively documented, which meant if Maya could prove the Lady's Progress had sunk, if she could document the cargo and its value, there might be insurance claims or historical restitution available beyond whatever physical recovery she accomplished. It was a long shot wrapped in bureaucratic complexity, but it was a path forward that didn't require treasure to exist, just evidence that treasure had once existed. She saved the research, closed the laptop, and watched dawn start to paint the Walmart parking lot in shades of gray and amber. In 3 hours, she'd meet Carlos Santos at Pier 7 and begin the actual investigation of what she'd bought. In 3 hours, she'd know if her engineering assessment was correct or if she'd wasted $100 on a hole full of mud. Lily stirred in the back seat, making small sounds that meant she was surfacing from sleep. June was already awake, sitting upright with her thermos, watching the sunrise with the patience of someone who'd learned that rushing dawn accomplished nothing. Today we see what inside, June said quietly. Today we learn if desperate is same as brave. Yeah, Maya agreed, feeling fear and excitement mixing in her bloodstream with equal intensity. Today we find out if I'm brilliant or broke. Possibly both. They committed everything to this path. The auction was done, the money spent, the ship legally owned. Now came the moment where theory met reality, and they discover whether Maya Chen's engineering degree and desperate optimism were enough to find value in something everyone else had dismissed as worthless. The sunrise completed itself across Rhode Island sky, painting clouds in colors that promised nothing but looked beautiful anyway. Maya started the car, feeling the engine turn over, hearing the sound that meant at least this much still worked. They had $27.43. They had a ship that needed investigation. They had each other and stubbornness and the absolutely insane belief that sometimes betting everything was the only choice left that looked like hope. Time to find out what they'd actually bought. Carlos Santos was already at Pier 7 when Maya, Lily, and June arrived at 7:45 a.m., 15 minutes early because desperation had a way of making punctuality feel like the only variable they could control. He stood beside a white work van with Santos Marine Salvage and Repair painted on the side in blue letters that had faded to the color of old denim. Beside him stood a younger man, maybe mid-20s, with the same weathered complexion and the rolling gait that marked people who'd spent formative years on boats. "This is my grandson, Miguel," Carlos introduced as they approached. Certified diver, marine archaeology degree from URI, smart enough to know better than getting into family business, but here anyway. Miguel smiled, extending a hand to Maya. "Heard you bought the wreck everyone said was worthless. Either you know something they don't, or you're about to learn an expensive lesson about maritime salvage." His tone carried curiosity rather than judgment, which was enough to make Maya relax fractionally. "Engineering degree from URI, class of 2015, Maya replied, shaking his hand. "So technically we're alumni. Though my degree's been less useful than advertised given the job market's opinion of single mothers with employment gaps." Miguel's expression shifted into recognition and something that looked like solidarity. "Marine Archaeology, 2019. Market's opinion of my degree is that I should have studied something employable. Hence working for my grandfather at rates that violate minimum wage laws." Carlos cut through the commiseration with the efficiency of someone who'd heard these complaints before and had limited patience for them. Enough bonding over worthless degrees. "We're burning daylight in good weather." He gestured toward the wreck, listing in water that looked deceptively calm in morning light. "Miguel's going to dive, assess structural integrity. C. If we can access the cargo holds without cutting through the hull. Maya, you'll observe from here. Answer questions about what you want prioritized. What about us? Lily asked, clutching Peanut with the hopeful expression of a 7-year-old who'd love nothing more than to be included in underwater adventures. You and grandmother are safety observers, Carlos answered seriously, addressing Lily with the respect that children noticed and appreciated. You watch from the pier, and if anything looks wrong, if Miguel surfaces early, if equipment fails, if weather changes, you tell us immediately. Most important job on any dive operation is having people watching who aren't distracted by being underwater. Lily straightened, clearly taking the responsibility seriously. I can do that. I'm very good at watching. The contract signing happened quickly. Carlos produced documents his lawyer had prepared overnight. 3 pages of clear language specifying terms, splitting percentages, defining responsibilities. Maya read carefully, her engineering training having taught her that details mattered and assumptions killed. The terms were exactly as discussed, 70-30 split in her favor, Carlos providing all equipment and expertise. Either party could terminate if costs exceeded reasonable recovery expectations. She signed with fingers that wanted to tremble, but didn't, making her signature legally binding on a gamble that looked more insane in morning clarity than it had in evening desperation. Miguel suited up with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd done this hundreds of times. Wetsuit, weight belt, tank, regulator, mask, fins. He clipped additional equipment to his belt. Underwater camera, measuring tape, pry bar, sample bags. The entire process took maybe 10 minutes, each movement economical and purposeful. Primary objective is assessment, Carlos instructed, clearly running through a checklist he'd refined over decades. Hull integrity, access points, visible cargo, condition of sealed compartments. Secondary objective is documentation, photos, measurements, anything that helps us understand what we're working with. Don't force anything. If hatches are sealed, we leave them sealed until we have proper equipment and plan. Miguel gave thumbs up, bit down on his regulator, and walked backward off the pier in a controlled fall that ended with barely a splash. The water swallowed him, and bubbles marked his descent toward the wreck 30 feet below the surface. Now we wait, Carlos said, settling onto a pier piling with the patience of someone who'd spent significant portions of his life waiting for divers to surface. He pulled out a thermos and poured coffee that smelled infinitely better than anything from gas stations. Brought extra. He offered cups to Maya and June. They stood in November cold, drinking coffee that was actually hot and actually good, watching bubbles track Miguel's position around the wreck. Lily maintained her observer post with serious focus. Peanut positioned to watch the water like a co-conspirator in vigilance. How long have you been doing salvage work? Maya asked, partly to fill silence, partly because she genuinely wanted to know who she'd just partnered with. 43 years, Carlos answered. Started as commercial diver in the 70s, did underwater welding and repairs, salvage operations, hull inspections. Saw enough wealthy people waste money on stupid projects that I figured I could waste my own money on stupid projects and at least enjoy it. He sipped his coffee. Most salvage operations recover nothing valuable. Maybe 1 in 20 finds something worth the effort. But that 1 in 20 makes up for all the others and funds the next gamble. What's the most valuable thing you've recovered? Carlos smiled with memory that looked fond. 1987. Found a yacht that went down in a storm off Block Island. Owner was a corporate executive who'd kept his offshore banking documents in a sealed safe in the cabin. We recovered the safe, and when we opened it, turned out he'd been hiding about $3 million in bearer bonds and cash from the IRS. He was already dead in the storm, but his estate paid us 20% recovery fee for finding assets they hadn't known existed. Best payday of my life. And the worst recovery? His smile faded. 2003, hired to investigate a fishing boat that had sunk with 2 crew members aboard. Families wanted closure, wanted bodies recovered for proper burial. We found them. The expression that crossed his face suggested that some recoveries cost more than money. That was the worst, because we succeeded at something I wish we hadn't found. The conversation lapsed into silence that felt respectful rather than awkward. They watched Bubbles track Miguel's position, watched Lily maintain her vigilant observation, watched morning light paint the harbor in colors that made even industrial marine settings look almost beautiful. Miguel surfaced after 23 minutes, swam to the pier ladder, and climbed up with movements that suggested excitement barely contained by professional composure. He pulled off his mask, spat out his regulator, and delivered his assessment with breathless urgency. That ship is intact. Like, seriously intact. The hull planking is solid, no significant deterioration. Marine growth is superficial. The construction quality is exceptional. Whoever built that vessel knew what they were doing. He unclipped the underwater camera, already scrolling through images. The cargo hatches are sealed, original hinges still functional. And here's the important part. There's no visible flooding of the main cargo compartments. The holds might actually be dry. Maya's heart started doing complicated things in her chest. Dry compartments meant preserved contents, meant possibility that cargo had survived. Are you certain? Miguel showed her photos on the camera's small screen. Look at the hatch seals. See that? Those are original rubber gaskets, degraded but still in place. And look at the waterline on the hull, interior visible through gaps in the deck planking. The water level inside is lower than outside. That means air trapped in sealed compartments, creating pressure differential. That cargo hold might have been underwater for a century and still maintained partial atmosphere. Carlos studied the photos with an expression that cycled through professional assessment to something that looked like genuine surprise. In 43 years, I've seen maybe 3 wrecks maintain seal integrity after extended submersion. If those holds are actually dry, if cargo was packed properly, we might be looking at preserved contents. What's the access situation? Maya asked, forcing herself to think practically despite the hope threatening to overwhelm rational thought. 2 hatches, Miguel explained, showing more photos. Primary cargo hatch amidships, approximately 3 feet square, secured with iron hinges and a locking mechanism that's corroded but might still be operable. Secondary hatch toward the stern, smaller, probably for additional cargo or equipment storage. Both sealed tight. We need to bring cutting equipment if we want to force them, or we could try removing the hinges if they'll cooperate. Carlos was already calculating, his mind clearly running through logistics and costs. Bringing the ship to my facility would be easier than trying to work on it in the harbor. I've got a crane barge, and a shallow water depth makes lifting feasible. Cost would be about $5,000 for the operation, but it means we can work in controlled conditions without worrying about weather or tides or curious onlookers. $5,000 might as well have been $5 million for someone with $27.43 in checking. Maya felt the familiar weight of impossible numbers, but Carlos was already continuing. I'll front the cost against potential recovery. If we find nothing, I eat the expense. If we find something valuable, we deduct it from your 70% before split. He looked at Maya directly. I don't make this offer lightly. But Miguel's assessment suggests this is worth the gamble, and I trust his judgment. The decision required about 3 seconds. Maya had already bet everything on this wreck. Adding Carlos's $5,000 to the wager didn't increase her personal risk, and refusing meant investigating the ship in open water with equipment she didn't have and expertise she couldn't afford to acquire. Do it, she agreed. Lift the ship, bring it to your facility. Let's open those hatches under controlled conditions and see what 130 years preserved. They scheduled the crane barge for the following morning, weather permitting. The operation would take most of the day, positioning the crane, securing lift cables, raising the vessel carefully to prevent structural collapse, transporting it to Santos Marine's facility 2 piers down, and positioning it in the yard where they could work without harbor authority breathing down their necks about timelines and penalty fees. That evening, parked in the Walmart lot, Maya researched opium trade economics with the focus of someone whose entire future depended on understanding historical commodities markets. What she learned made her hands shake. In 1851, opium was legal in the United States and hugely profitable. A standard shipping container, sealed tin, approximately 40 pounds, sold in San Francisco for anywhere from $800 to $1,500, equivalent to roughly $40,000 in modern currency accounting for inflation. The Lady's Progress cargo manifest listed medicinal supplies valued at approximately $60,000 in 1851 currency, which suggested 40 to 50 containers if the manifest was accurate. But here was where the mathematics became almost impossible to believe. Opium that had been properly sealed and stored could theoretically remain viable for centuries. The alkaloids that gave it medicinal and recreational properties were stable compounds, resistant to degradation if protected from moisture and air. Museums held opium samples from the 1700s that laboratory analysis confirmed still contained active compounds. If the Lady's Progress cargo holds were sealed, if the opium containers had survived, if the content were still intact, she might be looking at pharmaceutical-grade historical opium that collectors, museums, and research institutions would pay extraordinary amounts to acquire. Not for use, but for historical significance. The calculations made her dizzy. 40 containers at 40,000 modern equivalent, accounting for historical rarity and museum value, conservatively estimated at maybe 10 million total if they found anything close to intact cargo. But that was fantasy economics, building castles from spreadsheets and hopeful assumptions. She forced herself to model conservative scenarios. Cargo completely destroyed, holds flooded, containers rusted through, contents degraded beyond recognition or value. Even in worst case, the ship itself had historical significance. The Lady's Progress was documented in maritime records, had made 4 successful Asia routes, represented mid-19th century merchant vessel construction. Museums or collectors might pay $20,000 to $50,000 just for the ship itself as historical artifact. That was still enough to cover Carlos's costs, split the remainder, give Maya a cushion to find housing and rebuild. Not life-changing wealth, but life-stabilizing resources that would transition them from car sleeping to apartment having. Lily appeared from the back seat, wrapped in blankets, Peanut leading the way. "Mom, what happens if we find treasure?" The question deserved honesty tempered with caution. "If we find anything valuable, baby, we sell it carefully to people who want it for museums or collections. We use that money to get an apartment, buy you new clothes that actually fit, maybe help grandmother get medical care for her arthritis. We stabilize. What if we find a lot of treasure? Then we stabilize harder." Maya pulled her daughter close, feeling the solid reality of her, the reason all this gambling mattered beyond pride or vindication. "But we don't count treasure before we find it. Tomorrow they lift the ship. Day after tomorrow we open the cargo holds. Then we know what we actually have instead of what we hope for." June had been listening from the passenger seat, her silence the kind that preceded important observations. "Your grandfather," she said quietly, "he would like this. Using engineering degree to solve puzzle everyone else gave up on. Taking chance when safe choices already failed. Very foolish, very brave, very him." The comparison made Maya's throat tight. She barely remembered her grandfather. He died when she was 8. But his legacy had funded her mother's education, had created the foundation that made Maya's own college possible. That legacy had been built on the kind of desperate courage she was now attempting to replicate, betting everything on slim possibilities because guaranteed losses looked worse than risky chances. "We'll find out tomorrow if foolish and brave are the same thing," Maya said, more to herself than to her mother or daughter. The crane barge arrived at Pier 7 at 8 a.m. under gray skies that threatened rain, but held off long enough to matter. The operation was directed by a woman in her 50s who Carlos introduced as Captain Maya Chen. No relation to Maya, but the coincidence felt like the universe winking. She commanded a crew of 4 with the authority of someone who'd spent decades lifting heavy objects out of uncooperative water. The process was simultaneously terrifying and fascinating. Steel cables were positioned under the Lady's Progress hull, threaded through with diver assistance, secured to the crane's lifting mechanism with redundant safety systems. The crane itself was a massive articulated arm mounted on a barge that looked like it could lift a building if properly motivated. Lily watched from the pier with her grandmother, both maintaining safety observer positions that Carlos had emphasized were crucial. Maya stood beside Carlos and Miguel on the work barge, wearing a hard hat that felt simultaneously ridiculous and necessary, trying not to imagine all the ways this could go catastrophically wrong. The lift began at 9:37 a.m. The crane engaged with hydraulic sounds that were part industrial symphony, part mechanical groaning. Cables went taut. Water around the wreck churned and foamed. And slowly, so slowly it seemed impossible, the lady's progress began rising from water that had held it for 130 years. Hull emerged first, barnacles and growth streaming water, revealing planking that looked dark and weathered but intact. The list to starboard became more pronounced as lift progressed, water pouring from gaps in the deck, but the structure held together with integrity that suggested quality construction had been worth whatever premium it commanded in 1847. 10 feet up, 20. The cargo deck became visible, hatches still sealed, original hardware corroded but functional. 30 feet, and the entire vessel hung suspended above water, dripping in ancient and somehow still whole. Captain Chen directed positioning with hand signals and radio commands, the crane rotating slowly, transporting the ship towards Santos Marine Facility with movements that looked delicate despite the tonnage involved. The process took 40 minutes, and Maya spent every second holding her breath, certain something would break or collapse or prove that hope had been premature. But the lady's progress held together. The crane positioned it carefully in Santos Marine's workyard, lowered it onto wooden supports that Carlos's crew had prepared, secured it with chains and braces. At 11:13 a.m., Captain Chen shut down the crane and declared the operation successful. The ship sat in the salvage yard like a time traveler visiting the wrong century, surrounded by modern boats and equipment, utterly out of context and somehow magnificent in its displacement. Miguel immediately began documenting with professional cameras, taking measurements, recording details that would matter for historical verification and insurance claims. Carlos approached the primary cargo hatch with tools, examining the locking mechanism with an expert's eye. Original iron hardware, seriously corroded but potentially functional. We could try picking this lock before resorting to cutting through. Give me an hour. The waiting was torture. Maya paced the yard while Carlos worked, while Miguel documented, while June and Lily explored the facility with the caution of people accustomed to not touching things they couldn't afford to break. The November morning stretched toward afternoon, clouds thickening overhead, temperature dropping in the way that promised rain arriving with agenda. At 12:47 p.m., something in the hatch mechanism gave way with a sound like rusty metal screaming surrender. Carlos looked up, expression carefully neutral. Lock's open. Hinges will move if we're careful. Ready to see what you bought? Maya's heart hammered against her ribs with enough force to hurt. This was it. The moment where fantasy met reality, and they discover if engineering assessment and desperate optimism had been justified, or if she'd spent her last $100 on a hole full of mud and disappointment. She nodded, not trusting her voice. Carlos and Miguel positioned themselves on opposite sides of the hatch, gripping corroded hinges with gloved hands. They lifted together, slowly, the hatch resisting and then yielding with sounds that suggested metal remembering how to move after a century of stillness. The hatch swung open. Maya approached, looked down into darkness that had been sealed since 1851, and smelled something that made her breath catch. Dry wood. Cedar, maybe. The distinct scent of preserved timber rather than rot and decay. The cargo hold wasn't flooded. Miguel had been right. The seals had held. The compartment had maintained partial atmosphere. Whatever was down there had been protected from the ocean for 130 years. Miguel climbed down first with flashlight and camera, moving carefully, testing each step. His voice echoed up from below, excitement breaking through professional composure. There are containers, sealed tins, stacked in rows, labels mostly deteriorated, but some still visible. He paused, and Maya heard camera shutter sounds. Jesus Christ, there's dozens of them, maybe hundreds. Carlos descended next. Maya followed, climbing down a wooden ladder that creaked but held weight, emerging into a cargo space that flashlight beams revealed in fragments. The hole was maybe 20 feet long, 8 feet wide, ceiling height barely 6 feet, and it was packed. Sealed tin containers, each approximately 2 feet long, 1 foot wide, 8 inches deep, stacked in careful rows with rope netting securing them against ship movement. The tins were corroded, covered in verdigris and rust patterns, but intact. Labels had mostly deteriorated to illegibility, but on several containers Maya could make out partial text. Medicinal supply, Hong Kong. 847. Miguel was photographing everything, his hands actually shaking. These are opium containers. Original packaging, seals intact. He picked up one carefully, testing weight. Maybe 40 pounds. Standard shipping weight for processed opium. His voice dropped to something like awe. We need to do an accurate count, but I'm seeing at least 60 containers in this hold alone, and there's a secondary hold we haven't opened yet. The mathematics cascaded through Maya's mind with brutal clarity. 60 containers, conservatively valued at $500,000 each for historical significance and pharmaceutical research potential, meant $30 million in this hold alone. If the secondary hold contained similar cargo, if the containers opened to reveal preserved contents, if museums and research institutions competed for acquisition. She sat down hard on the nearest container, legs refusing to support weight, hands shaking, breath coming in gasps that might have been laughter or sobs, or the sound humans make when reality exceeds every possible expectation. "Mom?" Lily's voice called from above, concerned. "Are you okay? Did you find something?" Maya looked up at the hatch opening, at her daughter's silhouette against gray November sky, and felt tears start running down her face without permission or possibility of stopping them. "Yeah, baby," she called up, voice breaking. We found something really important." The inventory took 6 hours. Miguel documented every container with photographs, measurements, condition assessments. The primary hold contained 63 sealed tins. The secondary hold, opened with similar care, revealed 37 more. 100 containers total, each weighing approximately 40 pounds, each sealed in original 1847 packaging that had survived because the Lady's Progress had been built well enough to protect its cargo even in death. Miguel's professional assessment, delivered while photographing the final container, carried weight of expertise. Based on condition and historical significance, these containers are museum-quality artifacts. The opium itself probably has degraded potency, but the intact packaging, documented provenance, and connection to California gold rush trade routes makes this archaeologically invaluable. Conservative estimate for the collection, and I mean conservative, is between $20 and $40 million, depending on auction competition and institutional interest. The number was impossible. Maya had spent $100 on a wreck everyone dismissed as worthless. She'd gambled $27 remaining on the belief that engineering assessment mattered more than common wisdom. And she'd apparently bought cargo worth enough to solve every financial problem she'd ever had and create entirely new categories of wealth she didn't know how to process. Carlos was already making calls, contacting maritime lawyers, auction houses specializing in historical artifacts, museums with acquisition budgets, and research institutions that studied 19th century trade routes. The process of converting discovery into actual money would take months. Authentication, provenance verification, legal clearances, competitive bidding, but the preliminary interest suggested Miguel's estimates weren't fantasy. June climbed down into the cargo hold carefully, arthritis making the ladder difficult, but determination overcoming pain. She studied the containers with the same analytical focus she'd given Faber patterns for 40 years, touching corroded tin with fingers that remembered quality when she felt it. "Your grandfather," she said quietly to Maya, "would be very proud." Very stupid gamble that worked. That's kind of stupid. That evening, they didn't return to the Walmart parking lot. Carlos insisted they stay in the apartment above his salvage yard office. 2 bedrooms, functional bathroom, kitchen that hadn't been used in months but worked when tested. It wasn't luxury, but it had walls and doors and a shower with actual hot water pressure, and Lily cried when she realized they were sleeping in a real bed instead of the car's back seat. Maya stood in the shower until the hot water ran cold, washing away 73 days of car sleeping grime, letting water run through her hair while she processed what had happened. Yesterday, she'd had $27 and a ship everyone said was worthless. Today she had a cargo worth tens of millions and a future that looked nothing like the poverty she'd been drowning in. The vindication came 3 days later when the preliminary authentication results arrived. The containers were genuine, the cargo was historically significant, and the estimated value had increased to between 35 and 50 million, depending on how museums bid against each other. Maya's 70% share, after Carlos took his contracted 30, meant she was looking at approximately $25 to $35 million. The news spread through Newport faster than weather. The local paper ran a front-page story. Single mother's $100 gamble uncovers $50 million historical treasure. Cable news picked it up. Maritime archaeology journals requested interviews. And Brent Caldwell, the man who'd bid against her and warned she was making an expensive mistake, showed up at Santos Marine with reporters and an expression that suggested he'd swallowed something bitter and couldn't quite choke it down. Ms. Chen, he addressed her formally, clearly aware of cameras recording everything. I wanted to congratulate you on your discovery and apologize for underestimating your expertise. It takes courage to trust your instincts when everyone else dismisses them. The apology sounded practiced, delivered for public consumption rather than genuine contrition. But Maya accepted it with grace she'd learned from her mother. Thank you, Mr. Caldwell. Sometimes engineering degrees are more useful than people expect, especially when combined with desperation and nothing left to lose. The news coverage brought other people out of Newport's history. Families whose ancestors had worked on the Lady's Progress reached out, sharing photographs and documents. The insurance company that had never paid the loss claim in 1851 sent lawyers to negotiate settlement of a claim filed 130 years ago by heirs who'd long since died. The Historical Preservation Society offered funding to restore the ship itself for museum display. The auction happened 4 months later at a prestigious maritime museum in Boston. Museums, universities, pharmaceutical research companies, and private collectors competed for containers with provenance verified and authenticity guaranteed. The bidding exceeded all conservative estimates. Final sale total, $63 million. After Carlos's 30%, after legal fees, after taxes, after donations to maritime archaeology programs and the Historical Society, Maya Chen walked away with $28 million. She bought a house first. Not a mansion, not a showpiece, but a real house in Providence with bedrooms for Lily and June, a garage for the car they no longer needed to live in, and a yard where a 7-year-old could play without worrying about security guards or parking lot dangers. The house cost $400,000, which felt simultaneously extravagant and impossibly reasonable for someone whose net worth had been $27 4 months earlier. She set up trust funds for Lily's education, for June's medical care, for the future generations of Chen women who deserved not to worry about choosing between rent and groceries. She donated $2 million to URI's engineering program, funding scholarships for single parents whose degrees society had decided weren't worth the paper they were printed on. She started a foundation, the Lady's Progress Foundation, dedicated to funding maritime archaeology and helping people in desperate situations who needed capital to investigate opportunities everyone else dismissed as foolish. The foundation's first grant went to a formerly homeless man in Seattle who'd bought a storage unit at auction and found historical documents worth preserving. But the most satisfying moment came 6 months after the discovery, when Maya returned to Santos Marine and found Carlos and Miguel working on another salvage project. She handed Carlos a check for $5 million, 10 times what his contracted 30% had earned him. For believing me when nobody else did, she explained when he tried to refuse. For teaching Miguel to value knowledge over assumptions. For proving that sometimes experienced people recognize desperation that looks like courage and choose to gamble on it. Lily started third grade at a real school, where she made friends who'd never know she'd once lived in a car. She joined the drama club and performed in the spring play wearing the cupcake costume they'd found in the ship's captain's quarters. Apparently, even 19th century merchant captains appreciated whimsy. June's arthritis improved with proper medical care and physical therapy that insurance suddenly covered without question. And Maya went back to URI to teach engineering, accepting a faculty position that let her tell students something their textbooks didn't cover. Sometimes the most valuable skill isn't knowing all the answers. It's knowing when to bet everything on a question everyone else stopped asking. On the anniversary of the auction, Maya took Lily and June to the Maritime Museum, where the Lady's Progress now resided, restored and displayed with plaques explaining its history and discovery. They stood in front of the ship that had changed everything, and Lily read the display text aloud with 7-year-old precision. The Lady's Progress, discovered by Maya Chen in 2023, represents one of the most significant maritime archaeological finds of the century. Ms. Chen purchased the wreck at auction for $100 based on engineering assessment that proved more accurate than conventional wisdom. Her discovery yielded cargo valued at over $60 million and advanced understanding of 19th century trade routes and preservation techniques. "Is that really about us, Mom?" Lily asked, wonder coloring her voice. Maya pulled her daughter close, looked at the ship that had been simultaneously disaster and salvation, problem and solution, worthless junk and priceless treasure, depending entirely on who was looking and whether they had courage to see past surface assumptions. "Yeah, baby, that's about us. About what happened when we had nothing left to lose except everything, and we chose to bet on ourselves anyway." June stood beside them, hand resting on Maya's shoulder, her grip still strong despite age and arthritis. "Your grandfather would say you very foolish, very brave. I say you just very Chun. We are a family of people who see value where others see garbage. This is our gift, our curse, our legacy." The museum was closing, security guards politely encouraging visitors toward exits. They walked out into evening air that smelled like ocean and possibility. 3 generations of Chun women who'd survived homelessness and poverty and the particular cruelty of being dismissed by people who confused wealth with wisdom. The car they'd lived in for 73 days sat in their garage at home, preserved not from sentiment but from practical reminder. Sometimes the distance between poverty and security is $100 and the courage to bet everything on a question everyone else stopped asking. Maya had been that person in the conference room, listening to Brent Caldwell's condescending warnings, hearing everyone's confident assertions that the wreck was worthless, feeling every eye judge her as foolish or desperate or too broke to make rational decisions. She'd been right anyway, not because she was smarter than everyone else, but because she'd been willing to trust her engineering training over social consensus, to bet her expertise against their assumptions, to recognize that sometimes disaster disguises itself as opportunity to filter out everyone except the desperate or the brave. The Lady's Progress had been both disaster and opportunity. Maya Chen had been both desperate and brave. And the intersection of those variables had produced something neither alone could have achieved: transformation, vindication, proof that poverty was circumstantial rather than permanent when courage and knowledge found ways to collaborate. They drove home through Providence evening, past streets they'd once parked on when looking for safe places to sleep, past the library where they'd spent days applying for jobs that never materialized, past the McDonald's where they'd split one Egg McMuffin 3 ways and pretended it was enough. That life was 4 months behind them now, but Maya kept it close anyway. Not as trauma, but as testimony. Testimony that ordinary people could bet everything on themselves and win. That engineering degrees retained value even when the job market claimed otherwise. That single mothers living in cars still possessed agency and intelligence and the capacity to recognize opportunity when it surfaced from 130 years of darkness. Lily fell asleep in the back seat of their new car, Peanut the elephant clutched tight, dreaming probably of tomorrow's play rehearsal or her new friends or the 1,000 small joys that came from having a childhood instead of surviving one. June sat in the passenger seat reading Chinese news on her phone. The phone Maya had bought her with actual data plan instead of Wi-Fi scavenging, watching the city pass with a satisfied expression of someone who'd survived revolution, immigration, and poverty to arrive at something resembling peace. And Maya drove, hands steady on the wheel, mind already planning the foundation's next grants and engineering department curriculum improvements, and 1,000 ways she could pay forward the luck that looked like courage until courage produced actual luck. The house appeared ahead, lights on in windows that belonged to them, driveway that ended in garage instead of parking lot, home in the truest sense, shelter earned rather than borrowed, security built rather than rented, future owned rather than hoped for. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is spend your last $100 on something everyone says is worthless, trust your training over their certainty, and refuse to accept that visible poverty means invisible capability. Maya Chen had done that, had bought a wreck, found a fortune, changed everything, had proven that sometimes desperation and engineering expertise were exactly the combination needed to turn disaster into discovery, worthless into priceless, impossible into accomplished. The lady's progress had waited 130 years to be found by someone desperate enough to look, brave enough to bet everything, trained enough to recognize value, and stubborn enough to finish what everyone else dismissed as foolish. Maya had been that person, and in being that person, she became the proof that sometimes the most valuable inheritance isn't money or property, but the willingness to trust yourself when everyone else has already written you off. They'd survived. They'd gambled. They'd won. And tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities and the ongoing work of converting sudden wealth into sustainable security and meaningful legacy. But tonight they had home. They had each other. They had a ship in a museum with their name on the plaque. They had proof that courage counted, that training mattered, that betting everything could sometimes transform poverty into abundance when knowledge and desperation collaborated against conventional wisdom. That was enough. That was everything. That was the story they'd tell, not as fairy tale, but as testimony that ordinary people could achieve extraordinary outcomes when they refused to accept that impossible was the same as not yet attempted by someone desperate and trained enough to try. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.